Hello and welcome to the Beginning of Wisdom Live. I'm Andrew Schumacher. Excited to be here tonight. Going to be talking again about Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount and the law of God and all that good stuff. So we're going to be continuing our series on the Christian approach to the law, and we are in that portion of the show or of this series where we're talking mainly about the words of Christ, and this will be several parts that we'll deal with. Today we will get through the rest of the Sermon on the Mount and maybe a few other things, but that is the plan today. Before I jump into that, I do have some things I wanted to just bring you guys up to speed on, things to look for in the future regarding this show and just everything that's going on. So as you guys may be aware, something rather consequential happened in our country 2 weeks ago. We had an election day. The election itself is not over, but because of just the difficulty, and I've talked about this a little bit before on the show, but the difficulty of getting just uncensored, unfiltered information from the main, your main social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, that kind of stuff. I've talked before about other platforms and things like that, and I thought, I'm going to try some of this stuff out, and nothing much had panned out up until recently. There have been some things that have really gotten a lot of traction because of this issue. Now, what you may not know about this channel is basically since the time this channel was eligible under YouTube's rules for monetization, it has been demonetized and deranked pretty much since the get-go. And it's been pretty much an uphill battle, very difficult to get any kind of exposure out there. It's just been a big challenge. So because every single video I've had to ask for manual reviews, and it doesn't just allow that kind of stuff to stay up without extra work. So but there has been some real headway made recently. So I am planning on very soon taking the playbacks of these shows and also posting them on Rumble, which has been growing like crazy. And I've looked at it quite a bit, and really I like the format. It's pretty simple, but it has a lot of features that YouTube has. Not everything, but YouTube's been around for a long time, and they are always growing and things like that. So I'm planning on doing that. Now I'm also so that's sort of step one, is just kind of hosting them. I already host things a few other places just for the sake of security, so I don't lose stuff. But this would be more just to see what kind of traction it actually gets over there. And if it's getting really, really good traction, then that's awesome. That's just more exposure that we have and more that we're doing. But also if I see a pretty marked difference, I may also look into other avenues for live streaming down the road. Not something I plan on doing next week or anything, but I might be trying some things out to see if there's better reach on any sort of other live streaming platform. As of this moment, Rumble doesn't do live streaming, so I can't just try that out. But I do expect probably that at some point in the future they will. But as of right now, they just host video. But and also I do see this. We see a lot of the same people in the live chat every week. I see Valid Corey. I see you there. A regular, and appreciate you coming. It's awesome. And I'd like to be able to have a little bit better of a community aspect than just what's been going on here in the chats and stuff. And so I've toyed with doing a Facebook group, but I didn't really want to. But what will likely happen, I've already created personal accounts on Parler and MeWe, and Parler's sort of a Twitter, competitor. It does a lot of things Twitter does. MeWe is more of a Facebook competitor. It really encourages you to have your friends on there. It's not about this sort of, just blast the world with your opinions kind of a thing. And it has groups and things like that Facebook has as well. So that is a goal down the road, or something maybe. I haven't decided if that's for sure what I'm going to do, but I do want to try. I've been thinking about ways to try to make more community and more interaction than just the weekly show. So that's what's going on there. And I would just recommend anyone watching this that there's never really been a better time to look at these other platforms. Especially these three saw huge growth in the last couple of weeks. Parler, MeWe, and Rumble. And they're three different companies owned by different people. But not that there's not a lot of stuff out there, but you kind of want to go where your friends are. And I've already seen a lot of success with friends and people I know, getting onto those other platforms. So I've got links in the description for my profiles on Parler and MeWe. I've begun to start tinkering with Rumble, but I haven't uploaded anything yet. But I would just recommend you get out there and get ahead of the curve. Even if it's not the main thing that you do, if you do stuff at all social media online, just get there, invite your friends, all that kind of stuff before you get booted for good from whatever you're on now. Because we've been seeing it lately. My wife and I have seen people who are just regular people who are, just active on these platforms get their accounts taken away for no reason. Instagram is notorious. Facebook has become even more notorious for just kicking and booting people straight off the platform that with no reason, no explanation given. And I have lots and lots of friends who've talked about being in Facebook jail, and you've seen all the fact checking and all that kind of stuff. So just a recommendation: get yourself spread out a little more, and then hopefully I'll get to see you in those places. I am hoping, I have high hopes that some of these I've seen some people talking about moving where YouTube's algorithm was just keeping them down, and they went over to Rumble and just blew up. So even though Rumble's nowhere near the size of YouTube as a whole, people have really seen a lot of support there. So I am excited to get my content up there, and then if it does really seem to take off, just kind of make that the main home and that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's just some updates about what's going on in life. But let's go ahead and jump in. We are going to be talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we talked about Matthew 5:17 through 20, which was about it was sort of Jesus introducing his general position, his general relationship to the law. But now we're gonna move past that. But before we do, as I've done in every part of this series, I do want to kind of briefly recap where we're at this point. So let me go ahead and pull that up here, and we will discuss it. So up to this point, just in a quick nutshell, before we're talking about Jesus, we talked about Genesis and the Torah and things like that. So in Genesis and the Torah, we saw that as a whole, they teach that we should think differently about different kinds of law. Some law has always been considered binding, even if not found explicitly in the text as a command, while some is given to certain people at certain times for certain reasons. This forms the foundation the text uses to distinguish different kinds of law. that we recognize today by many labels, but commonly as moral, ceremonial, and civil. So I think these are legitimate ways of describing different types of law found in the law of Moses. But then we're going to begin to see how that's developed in the New Testament with what Jesus is talking about. Jesus begins his teaching on the law by first affirming it alongside the rest of Scripture, promising that it will be preserved and not lost. Not one, jot or tittle will pass away. But when Jesus begins to talk about commandments, he changes all of his language, as we saw last week, while referring not to the commandments, as in the law, the way he referred to the law, but these commandments. So he's talking about what he's teaching and what he's about to spend some time with. In that little prologue section, it points to a very high view of Scripture, and also elevates Jesus' own teaching to the level of the Torah. As Jesus, as he said, God's word, it will always persevere. I have not come to destroy it or come against it in any way. But these commandments, you'll be great in the kingdom of heaven if you teach them, and less if you don't, that kind of thing. So he's going to now talk about really his own commandments. So that's today's main point. We're going to be talking about how Jesus' commandments should be read, and how all the commandments should be read as principles, but then, how we should look at Jesus' commandments as well. So in Matthew 5, he compares and contrasts the written Torah and prior interpretations with his own teaching, given on his own authority, not just as a simple interpretation of the Torah. And then Matthew 6, and really 6 and 7, he expands into teaching things not connected at all with the Torah directly, but based again on his own authority. So he goes on to teach more, but not in this direct comparison with the Torah as he does throughout the rest of chapter 5. So let's go ahead and jump right into chapter 5, and we'll see what we're talking about. So this section of chapter 5, after that little prologue, he gives us 6 examples of commandments, followed by his teaching on them. And he talks about murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, retaliation, and love for your enemies. In each of these examples, he draws from the Torah. There's something in the Torah, as you can see these references, but not always in the same way, as we'll see. Sometimes it's a direct quote, and how he deals with that quote comes from a certain angle. Sometimes it's not a direct quote, and we're left to kind of guess whether he's talking about other things, like other traditions coming in, or maybe just the common understanding of the text. And other times and so that plays into what he's talking about. Now, so let's begin with murder and adultery, and these are the most commonly known. When people talk about, oh yeah, Jesus taught on the Torah, and he expanded the Torah, and he made it about what's in your heart. They're thinking of these 2 examples with murder and adultery, and I group them together because really they're treated pretty much the same, at least the principle in view. They relocate the keeping of the commandment to the heart. So one cannot be truly innocent of murder by merely abstaining from unjust killing of another person. Harbored anger is considered to be sin as well, and to be likened to murder. One cannot be innocent of adultery by merely being physically faithful. So if you're married and you don't actually go out and run around on your spouse, that doesn't mean you haven't committed adultery, at least, in some sense. He says, even if you harbor lust in your heart, God knows, and you are guilty. You've committed adultery in your heart. These set us up with what to expect, that Jesus will make obedience, deeper than just this outward action we see in the Torah. And that's true enough, but Jesus does more than this when he goes to the other examples. It's not always just, oh yeah, look to your heart, and that's where it really is, as we begin to see as we go on to the next example. So the next example is divorce. So I went ahead and put this text in there. So in verse 31, it says, and And it was said, so Jesus is speaking here, and it was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for a matter of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So let's look at what he's quoting. So he's alluding to something in the Torah about the certificate of divorce, but he's not specifically quoting it. In fact, if he really meant to quote it, he's misquoting it, which I don't believe Jesus does. So, but let's look at the text. So this is Deuteronomy 1:24, 1 through 4. It says, when a man takes a wife and he marries her, and then she does not please him because he found something objectionable, and writes her a letter of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her away from his house, and she goes from his house, and she goes out and becomes a wife for another man, and then the second man dislikes her and writes her a letter of divorce and places it in her hand and sends her from his house, or if the second man dies who took her to himself as a wife, her first husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to become a wife to him after she has been defiled. For that is a detestable thing before Yahweh, and so you shall not mislead into sin the land that Yahweh your God is giving to you as an inheritance. So notice here, Jesus said, and it was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce, which alludes to this text, but it's not a direct quote. The text says, if a man gives a certificate of divorce, and it says if the first man does it, and then if the second man does it, the command, the only actual, stated purpose, in this whole passage is, if that happens, if this kind of thing happens, she basically is divorced and remarries, and then either she divorces the second husband or he dies, the first husband is no longer allowed to marry her again. He can't go and marry her a second time. That's the actual command. But but Jesus says he must give her a certificate. Well, there's nothing in the text that actually says he must do that. It's just something that they did. It alludes to it as a practice that's just happening. Likely, I think Jesus is quoting a tradition that the text is referring to, so something present all the way back to when the Torah was written, or one that developed, or maybe even there's something that developed around the text. This idea you must give the certificate, or else, because look at this text, it mentions it. So additionally, also notice that Jesus' own teaching on this issue, when he says whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, that kind of stuff, he's not just talking about the heart issue. He's talking about actual outward actions, but those actions are something deeper and not specifically all that the text says. It isn't just an amplification. The original teaching is being corrected, if not in some sense outright contradicted. Now remember, what's the original teaching? What Jesus says, which is you must give a certificate of divorce. At the least, he's saying that you're not keeping the commands of God by doing what Jesus says they think they must do. So there's this idea that perhaps, and we're guessing a little bit, but that if somebody doesn't do this certificate, if he just divorces someone without it, then he's not keeping the command of God, or something along those lines. Here he's saying that either the command or the common understanding of the issue is simply wrong and is correcting it. And I think the idea is, again, think of the principle we learned from the first two. Murder is not just killing someone unjustly, it also incorporates anger and all of that. Here, in talking about divorce, he's pointing out, look, you're not in compliance with the Torah or in compliance with the law just because you give a certificate and that's, hey, you've done it, you've done all you need to do. He says, no, I mean, there's plenty of Old Testament we could talk about that goes against that, but he says, if you divorce a woman, you cause her to commit adultery. So there's this sense of the divorce itself is a sin in, except in the matter of sexual immorality. It is a sin all by itself. It doesn't, you've kind of concocted this idea that you can do the certificate thing and it makes it not a sin, but it is. It is, it is unfaithfulness. So again, this is different than with murder and adultery, because it's not just a matter of the heart. Jesus, but it is something where he is setting the bar much, much higher than where they think it is. And what's interesting is where they think it is incorporates a command not explicitly found in the text. So they've added a command not found in the text, and by doing so, they've actually lessened what God expects. So what we're going here, what they've heard isn't necessarily scripture. He could be simply correcting a wrong view, but this is one way that Jesus is discussing the law. So the next one is on oaths. So I'll go ahead and read the text. Verse 33. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people of old, do not swear falsely, but fulfill your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, because it is the throne of God, or by earth, because it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, because it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, because you are not able to make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, no, no, and anything beyond this is from the evil one. So here, like with divorce, Jesus cites a text, but not exactly. Most likely text is Leviticus 19:12. He says, you shall not swear falsely in my name, and so one of you profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. And this comes, if you read the wider section here, it's all about dishonesty and lying and things like that. It's forbidding that kind of speech. But Jesus also adds this idea of fulfill your oaths to the Lord as something that you heard. Again, it could come from another tradition. It could come from an expounding on the text as it is. But notice the original text does not have a positive command about oaths, but rather a prohibition against a lying oath. Jesus expands on the original once again, not by making this a mere matter of the heart and mind, but making it stronger outwardly. More than a prohibition against false oaths, Jesus forbids oaths generally, or at least based on external factors. Let yes be yes and no be no. When I say external factors, he's talking about don't swear by Jerusalem or by your own head or any of that stuff. He says just let yes be yes and no be no. So but he's not saying exactly what the text, it's again unclear. As with all the other examples, he didn't appeal to any text of the Torah or otherwise to support his own teaching. So again, this is just, but I say, and what Jesus commands is his own. So no scriptural authority. He teaches that anything more than an honest yes or no is from the evil one. And this will be very important later on. And again, I point out, as it said there, that Jesus, the actual text says, don't swear falsely, but Jesus is correcting, do not swear falsely, but fulfill your oath. So he adds that little bit. And then what he ends up saying don't do is basically don't make oaths. It's whether it's false or not, that's sort of taken as a given, I would say. But then, Jesus says on his own authority, but I say, here's what you should do. And this, as we see, this is a pattern that is developing here. The next one is retaliation. So it says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer, but whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. And the one who wants to go to court with you and take your tunic, let him have your outer garment also. And whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So, again, we have that you've heard it was said, but I tell you, but I say. So this is the fifth out of 6 examples. This time he does cite the Torah exactly, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, no extra phrasing. This is just like with murder and adultery. Does he relocate the command in the heart? No, he doesn't. Once again, he is talking about outward behavior, and he does so in contrast to the written text. The original sources for this text, for this phrase, or at least this phrase used in this way, are in 2 places, and they basically say similar things. Exodus 21:24 talks about what sorts of injuries should be basically given to one who injures a pregnant woman, and talks about eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, burn for burn, things like that. Leviticus 24:20, which lays out basically the same idea, but it's just one man and another man. So when there is an altercation, a physical altercation or a physical attack, then and the one who's wrong is supposed to receive this type of retribution back. In the Torah texts, it calls for the involvement of judges and then the penalty. So it says, go before the judges. All of that's in there. So the problem looking at this one is just to wonder, why is Jesus offering any sort of corrective? He's citing the text directly. He's not citing any sort of extraneous tradition. Why doesn't he just simply say, follow the Torah if someone strikes you? Where do we find turn the other cheek in the Torah? Once again, he's offering his own teaching with his own authority, as far as his take on the text. On careful examination, Jesus doesn't contradict the Torah, but speaks again of a deeper principle. The Torah teaching concerns penalties to be imposed by the judges. It's civil law. It's how do you handle this situation under the civil code. Jesus' teaching doesn't strictly concern loss of eye or tooth. It doesn't say, someone injures you greatly in these ways, but it concerns how to respond to less injurious injustices. He points out that if someone simply strikes your cheek, or takes your tunic, or forces you to walk a mile, and there are scholars who think that these come from things that the Romans would force people to do, and really just to show their power over them and things like that. That you just do it, and you do it extra, and it's this sort of heaping, grace upon them, sort of a thing. But again, so one could say, and I think it wouldn't be wrong to say that, maybe what Jesus is saying is that, people sort of like they take the idea of the certificate of a divorce to be something that sort of gets you off the hook from the sin of the divorce, that maybe if people want to do this eye for eye, tooth for tooth thing, that they want to impose that on every smallest slight that they receive. And Jesus is saying, don't do that. Like, just let it go, basically. Or show them, the cheek thing is really to show them, like, oh, you sinned against me. Do you want to do it again? Like, it's really just putting it in their face what they are doing, but it's doing so in a non-retaliatory way. So that's sort of one way of looking at the text. But again, the question is more about, and the thing I want us to focus on here, just to understand, is that Jesus is talking out from his own authority, and he's taking this text and he's saying, you've heard this, but now I'm just going to give you something. And there's nothing along those lines, again, found in the Torah. So that's kind of a big part. All right, then the last one here from Matthew 5 is love for enemies. Verse 43. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. in order that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven, because he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not the tax collectors also do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing that is remarkable? Do not the Gentiles also do the same? Therefore, you be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So we get these phrases, or at least these concepts, love your neighbor, well known, love your neighbor as yourself, straight out of the Torah from Leviticus 19:18. Hate your enemy is also found in the Torah in a sense, Deuteronomy 23:3-6, and I'll go ahead and read that section to you. Again, it's not verbatim, but you get the idea from it. It says, an Ammonite or a Moabite may not come into the assembly of Yahweh. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants may come in to the assembly of Yahweh forever, because they did not come to meet you with food and with water when you came out of Egypt, and also because they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharaim, to act against you to curse you. But Yahweh your God was not willing to listen to Balaam, and Yahweh your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because Yahweh your God loved you. You shall not promote their welfare or their prosperity all your days forever. So this is pretty strong language. It's not just, it's, again, this is, it doesn't say, quote, hate your enemy, but it does really give that sense that, yeah, this is your enemy. You're not supposed to bless them in any sense. So Jesus, again, is somewhat free with the citation. The text never says it, but it does clearly forbid promoting their welfare. And again, Jesus' corrective is based on his own authority. And again, he does not directly contradict the source text, but does alter how one should think about the principle. So if we're looking at the Torah, and the Torah is talking about these nations, and you just write them off, and Jesus said, well, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that's a little different than what the Torah actually said. Now, again, it's not direct. He's not directly contradicting the Torah, because the Torah is speaking specifically about specific nations, and it says to the 10th generation. Well, that's not forever, but even though it does actually say forever. So there's some question about, I think that Jesus isn't wanting us to be literal with that text. I mean, he just says, you understand this idea of hating your enemy. Well, I'm going to teach you something different than that. And again, the appeal, and this is interesting, his appeal is how it will credit you if you love those who hate you. And what he's actually teaching, those aren't part of the Torah. Where does the Torah say, what credit is it to you if you love those who love you? Like, it doesn't teach that way. It just gives the commands and the code, and here you go. He's introducing a whole new way of thinking. Now, does that mean there are no antecedents in the Old Testament for this? No, I think there are, but it's again not just the hard letter of the law that he's pointing to. He's talking about, look, there's a principle in here, and I want to draw something else out. And sometimes it's with murder and adultery, it's taking the principle already there and amplifying it and internalizing it. But when it comes to loving your neighbor and hating your enemy, he's saying, actually, I want you to think about it deeper so that you actually don't hate your enemy. And it's let's go the other direction with that. And, like when he teaches elsewhere about the Samaritan, he expands neighbor to include those who hate you. And it's not just about the heart. It's, again, about the outward behavior. So to summarize chapter 5, this is the end of chapter 5. Remember, morality and sin, remember how they were expressed in Genesis. Jesus takes this section to remind hearers of the same principle. While the text of the Torah is useful in these cases, we should be looking for the principle of behavior it may signify, which may even seem to be the opposite of the direction the text is going. The text may go one direction, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but in the greater context, understand that this is a civil code meant to keep justice in the land. But when you're speaking of individuals, there might be a different way that you're supposed to behave that doesn't contradict that in any way. It just, again, it's just there's a deeper principle there. And primarily it points us to Jesus himself as our primary source on moral behavior. We have to use what he said as a guide. These are his commandments. We cannot just read the Torah apart from Christ and think we understand it. We need his light on it to show the full truth. Everything when Jesus says, but I say, I'm sorry, but these, yes, he's drawing on a principle that either fits or modifies or does something with the text, but it isn't something one would just pick up off the page of the text. Now, there are some very interesting things. I haven't done a study on this particular subject on this, but sometimes when you read in the Second Temple Jewish literature around when Jesus was around, you find some really interesting things there that really dovetail with what Jesus and the apostles teach in the New Testament. And there are some, but when Jesus and the apostles teach it, it's based on Jesus and his own work, whereas these texts predate Jesus. And we don't think of them as prophetic or anything, or I certainly don't. But there's a sense in which, and certainly, and some of these texts even are not part of, the Apocrypha or anything. They're just even other texts, but they just talk about things that it's like, wow, Jesus did stuff like this, and it seems to show that through God's providence, I believe, the people who are just reading and soaking in the text and thinking it through were coming to conclusions that fit with what Jesus was going to teach and what the apostles were going to teach on a lot of different subjects of theology. And now, it's not universal by any means. There's lots of conclusions they came to that were completely off as well. But that's just, it's an interesting thing to study. I haven't done that with this. I don't know if that's the case with any of these teachings here in Matthew 5, but it is something that kind of happens on some other cases. So let's go through the rest of the sermon. So this part, it won't, we're not going to go line by line, issue by issue through chapter 6 and 7, but I just want to make some comments about the rest of the text. So Matthew 6 through 7, as with chapter 5, the rest of the sermon is taught on Jesus' own authority. At this point, he stops citing the Torah completely. He doesn't say, you've heard it said or it was written. He's not working on with the Torah anymore. He just starts giving moral teaching himself on his own authority. At many points, he exhorts the people to do what he says in opposition to the hypocrites. But it is not said that they are violating Torah or adding traditions. It's just that they're being hypocrites. They are merely doing things with an eye to this world and not to God. A very important point to consider is it is at the end of this section, at the end of 6 and 7, where Jesus teaches many moral principles without reference to the Torah. It's at this point that he says this, which is a very common verse brought up by Torah observant Hebrew roots type folks. Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and expel demons in your name and perform many miracles in your name? And then I will say to him plainly, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So what is Jesus referring to when he says lawlessness? the vast majority of this sermon is not him just teaching the Torah. The first part was him expounding on the Torah, but adding things on his own authority, for what seems to be, more than one reason. But they're his own commandments, given over the preceding 2.5 chapters. Disobeying those is lawlessness. This really is the new and greater Sinai, and Jesus is the greater Moses. There's a reason he's on a mountain and teaching law. It's because Jesus is establishing his kingdom, and these are the principles on which he's establishing it. He clearly elevates his own perspective above the Torah at many times. He says, "You've heard it said," and again, I don't think he's contradicting it. He's just saying, "You've heard it said," quotes Torah verbatim, "but I tell you." I mean, no rabbi would do that. They would talk about what people say about it and that kind of thing. Jesus feels perfectly fine teaching an ethic on his own authority without reference to the Torah, or at least without dependency on the Torah. So some summary thoughts. It's a clear parallel with the Sinai covenant. He goes to a mountain, teaches the law. He affirms scripture, but elevates his own commandments at least to the same level, if not higher. He repeatedly contrasts his own teaching with the surface level understanding of the Torah, and he adds his own teaching simply not found anywhere in the Torah. It's an interesting thing if someone ever says, "Oh, you just," and people accuse me of this all the time. "Oh, you're just trying to get rid of the law. You hate the law." And I'm like, no, I'm not trying to get rid of the law. And everyone who, not everyone, but many who say that, "Oh, you just want to take it easy and do the easy way, and the law is, you think the law is too hard." And I'm like, no, this is my, scripture. If you look at it, like I said, I didn't quote the specifics, but just to give you the headlines, so to speak, as it's in these little headings here. Charitable giving. He teaches how to do that in such a way, basically secretly. How to pray. That you don't do it in this big showy way. You pray to your Father in secret. He sees what's done in secret. Same with fasting. How to fast. You don't have any of this in the Torah. Storing up treasure in heaven. Dealing with anxiety and worry. Then chapter 7, judging others, ask, seek, knock, the narrow gate. How to recognize false prophets. I mean, recognizing false prophets, it's interesting. It's that is in the Torah, but what Jesus says here, he doesn't reference, Deuteronomy 13 or 18, and he just says, "By their fruits, you'll know them." So, for the vast majority of these, it's just Jesus teaching on his own authority, things that you can't find specifically taught in the Torah. So that's a big deal. And the fact is that stuff is harder than the stuff, it's not harder it's harder to not worry. It's harder to, to make sure that you do things without trying to get credit, to avoid taking credit for things. I mean, that getting credit feels good, right? It's harder to avoid that than to avoid pork. Like, the Sermon on the Mount goes far beyond the Torah in terms of, if you want to talk difficulty in terms of keeping, commands. And Jesus is clear. These commands, these are binding. You have to do these. No question about it. So, it's interesting where one might expect him to give us the way we should have understood the Torah. He does not say, but it really says. You've heard it say, but here's what it really says, or it really means. Instead, he says, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say. And that's a huge difference. And then he's establishing his own authority, not ever in contradiction with the scriptures, but on equal footing with the rest of the scriptures. What Jesus speaks comes straight from God because he is God. All right, I'm going to do one other quick thing here, and this will be, in a sense, a little bit of a teaser for the next part of this series. And that's to talk about Jesus and the Ten Commandments. This is sort of a smaller section that won't take very long to get through. So we finished the Sermon on the Mount. Now let's talk about another thing Jesus did. Jesus talked about the Ten Commandments. He talked about all 10. But it's interesting how he did so. So kind of his own expansions notwithstanding, Jesus' statements in the Sermon on the Mount about murder and adultery are still affirming those commands as they were. I mean, he certainly, when he says, hey, it's a lot easier to commit these sins than you thought, he isn't, by doing that, saying, oh, now you can just go ahead and do it. You can go ahead and kill someone and it's not murder now. Like, he doesn't, it's not an either or thing. So yes, he expands, but he's also affirming those commands when he does that. So let's look at the 10 commandments and show what Jesus says about those. So have no other gods before me / make no images. So I include these together because on some Jewish understandings of the 10 commandments or the 10 words, they count them slightly differently here at the beginning. Our common way the Christians understand them is commandment number 1 is have no other gods before me. Commandment 2 is make no images. On a Jewish understanding, which may have gone back to Jesus' time, since Jesus doesn't really mention images specifically, so that the fact that he touches on all of them, it may be that he's lumping these two together, where the first one is, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, is sort of the first word. The second word is a combination of these two. No other gods, make no images. It's kind of all one thing. Like, don't be idolaters, worship me only. It's really kind of the same command, just with some nuance or some more texture to it if you look at it that way. But anyway, Jesus certainly affirms this. Matthew 4:10, when speaking to Satan, he says, go away, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve only him. So again, prohibition against images not specifically mentioned, though, we talked about how Jewish accountings may combine this into one command. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Matthew 23:16 says, woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. Whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by his oath. Fools and blind people, for which is greater the gold or the temple that makes the gold holy? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it is bound by his oath. Blind people, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift holy? Therefore, the one who swears by the altar swears by it and everything that is on it. The one who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells on it. And the one who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one who sits on it. So again, he's saying now we just talked about Jesus saying don't make oaths, but he still says if you're making an oath, you're bound to that oath. So if you swear by the throne of God, don't just not do that or just disregard that. That's not exactly, that's could be seen as taking the Lord's name in vain. There's different ways of looking at it, but this is potentially a reference to that commandment. Honor your father and mother. Matthew 15:4, Jesus said, honor your father and mother, and the one who speaks evil of father or mother must certainly die. But you who say, whoever says to his father and his mother, whatever benefit you've received from me is a gift from God, need not honor his father, and you make void the word of God for the sake of your tradition. Hypocrites, Isaiah correctly prophesied about you, saying, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. and they worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So obviously he affirms honoring your father and mother. Do not commit murder, we already discussed in Matthew 5. Also, Matthew 19:18 through 19 lists 5 commands, and it's included there. And he affirms it there. Same with adultery. And then do not covet, affirmed in Mark 7:21 through 23. It says, for from within, from the heart of people, come evil plans, sexual immoralities, thefts, murders, adulteries, acts of greed, malicious deeds, deceit, licentiousness, envy. There's your covetousness, abusive speech, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a person. Okay, so we saw, did I? Oh, I think I missed one. Because I didn't include theft. Where's theft? But hey, it was there. Because see, right there, thefts. So he says, thefts are obviously not okay. But what about the Sabbath, right? Sabbath, commandment number 4. So in no text of the gospel do you find this kind of affirmation where Jesus simply says, well, you know the law, keep the Sabbath. It's not there. Not the same way he does with the other commandments. And in fact, the Sabbath is discussed more than any of the other 9 commandments in the Gospels. As you can see, there were some kind of tangential references that may be about the other 10 commandments, but there's nothing tangential about the Sabbath. It gets discussed a lot, but it's always in the context of a controversy. Some controversy about what Jesus was doing typically on the Sabbath. So in the next installment, that's what we're going to spend our time on, is we're going to talk about all of those, because in part of the study I've done on the whole issue of the law is I went through every text in the Gospels that talks about the Sabbath. And it is eye-opening when you look at them all together. And you see what is there and what isn't there. But that will have to be saved for another episode. So just the conclusions to draw from this episode. So when speaking generally, Jesus is affirming of the law, as he is affirming of all the scriptures. When speaking specifically, he does not affirm every commandment in the same way. We're going to see this in more detail as we go, but we've already seen this a little bit. Some commandments are merely affirmed without further comment. Yeah, theft is wrong. Honor your father and mother. Those are simply reaffirmed. Some commands are expanded on and intensified, as we saw in Matthew 5. Some commandments become points of contention, as we will see with the Sabbath. And what is and isn't affirmed, as we will see at the end, ends up mirroring what the Torah presents as moral and ceremonial laws. So we've seen already those distinctions exist within the Torah itself. So we know how to recognize them. As we come to the New Testament, we're going to see what is affirmed, what isn't affirmed, what is, what we have a different perspective on, basically the way that Jesus did in Matthew 5. We'll start to see that. Now, Matthew 5, he's not necessarily talking about ceremonial laws, but he's pointing us in this direction of understanding things in a way deeper than just, the letter of the law kind of a thing. But again, sometimes it just seems to be the letter. So it's really interesting stuff. I'm really looking forward to continuing this study. So let's go ahead and grab any questions you guys have today. Let me go ahead and pull up what I've got. All right. So the first question. So we're doing our Q&A. I didn't mention it earlier in the show, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. They don't have to be about this specific topic. If you have other theological type questions or whatever, just put the word question at the beginning All caps makes it easier to see, but we'll probably catch it either way. So Dustin Neely asks, Mr. Drew, I'm interested in your thoughts on Matthew 5:48 versus Luke 6:36. Well, so Matthew 5:48, I believe, that was right at the end. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, if my memory serves. Yes, and then Luke 6:36. So Luke 6:36. Let's see. Do you mean 6:34? Because I'm not showing, unless it's in a footnote. I don't see a verse 36 in Luke chapter 6. Maybe it's in the King James or something. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's there in a. Yeah, I'll have to shoot another comment there if it's specifically a different version. Let me just look that up real quick in the King James. Oh, I see what I did wrong. I did something wrong. If you're you're not, but Luke, I was telling my system to look up Matthew. There's no Matthew 6:36. There's a Luke one though. Okay, so it says, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Very interesting. So I can see, looking at Luke 6 here, it's a version of the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of the same teachings in here. As I mentioned last week, this, Jesus being an itinerant preacher, he preached a lot of the same stuff over and over again. So we may have things differently in different texts. So honestly, I don't think there's a verses there. I think if we look at the Matthew passage it's curious. It is because the Matthew passage, let me just double check, this comes at the end of in a section about loving your enemies, which is what this section, I'll go ahead and bring it up here so you can see. So this is Luke 6, talking about love. If you love those who love you, what kind of credit is that to you? Love your enemies, do good, lend back, expect nothing. So he's kind of incorporating that into there. Your reward will be great. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. I haven't thought about it too deeply, so I'm not sure if there's really I don't think that there's, when you say verses, I'm not sure what you mean. If you mean, is one of these right and one of them wrong? Like we've got a textual variant here or something. I don't think we even need to say, I don't know if there's a textual variant or if that's the issue. Frankly, I don't know if it even matters though, because like I said, Jesus preached these same things different ways at different times. And I think it lends maybe a little bit of, flavor to what we were seeing in Matthew, that, maybe being perfect has something to do with being merciful. Perhaps, I don't know. I haven't thought about it too deeply. If you have any thoughts yourself, by all means, let me know, and I'd be willing to think on that for sure. All right. Next question from Lazika Dimitru. You all keeping pace with Unlearn the Lies live stream? Definitely not. I'm aware of the channel. I was not aware if they're doing a live stream. Are they doing one right now also on the Sermon on the Mount? That would be interesting. But no, I have no idea. I I know the channel. I did not know that he was doing anything live. Bible History Science asks, in Galatians 2, Peter refuted Judaizing Gentiles to live like Jews. In Revelation 2, Jesus called it blasphemy for Gentiles to call themselves Jews. Isn't this the same teaching? I don't think so. Because, and let me see if I can sort of explain why. I'm going to bring up I'm going to bring up another tab here. So let's look at these two things kind of side by side. So Galatians 2, we've talked about before. Let's see, Revelation 2, if I'm remembering right, I think I know what we're going to be talking about. So in Galatians 2, we have where Paul confronts Peter, right? And I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but I think the key text you're referring to is there at the end in verse 14. It says, if you, although you are a Jew, live like a Gentile, not like a Jew, how can you try to compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So I think that, yeah, there's a Paul has a problem trying to compel Gentiles to live like Jews. And this is in the context of within the church of you have Jewish believers and Gentile believers, all believers in Christ, and the Jewish believers live like Jews still, which is not surprising. Paul even makes the statement that Peter seems to not be, he's living like a Gentile. And what does that mean? I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but basically he's pointing out that Peter's being a hypocrite. He's just not, he's acting one way while he's, trying to make someone live a different way. Well, in Revelation chapter 2, Revelation 2 is letters to the churches. And I believe you're probably referring to here in verses, and the church of Smyrna. I'll just read this letter. It's pretty short. It says, and to the angel of the church of Smyrna write, this is what the first and the last says, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who call themselves Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of the things which you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you may be tested, and you will experience affliction 10 days. Be faithful unto death, until death, and I will give you the crown of life. The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. So what's going on? Who are these people who call themselves Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan? Well, in this case, it's talking about slander of these people, and he's not, Paul wasn't saying, that the Jews, that the Jews were, like he recognizes both these groups within the church. And the only thing Paul really condemns, he doesn't condemn Gentiles who, necessarily living like Jews. He tells them things like, hey, if you're not circumcised, don't go get circumcised. But, in the context of it all, he's talking about, there's these people who are trying to get you to do this stuff. Don't go along with it. Now, is that what's going on here? I kind of don't think so. If you look at the rest of these letters, John, writing this, or really Jesus speaking these words, is saying things the way he speaks to each of the churches. It's really a very black and white thing. There's the people, who live for what's under the sun, or that kind of thing, and then there's the heavenly people, and it's like two different groups. And when he's talking to the churches, he says, hey, you've got these evil people and these evil people that are, maybe in this case, are coming against you. They're slandering you. I don't think this is necessarily from inside the church. Now, Jesus certainly refers to problems within the church, but in those cases, it seems he specifically mentions it. You know, he says, you've allowed this and that teaching to happen in your church and stuff like that. So he makes clear distinctions. So when it just says the slander of those who call themselves Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan, I think he's talking about unbelievers, people who do not believe in Christ. And I don't think he's talking about the Judaizers. This is my opinion based on the rest of Revelation. So who that leaves it so, like, who the heck are these people? It says they call themselves Jews but are not. Well, there's a couple. I mean, you could postulate that these are just some other faction of Gentile people that call themselves Jews. It's weird. It's I guess it's possible. What I think is going on is this whole book of Revelation does this. You know, it speaks of the people of God in terms that are really reminiscent of Israel itself. I believe that what's going on, for example, when he talks about the after the letters in, I think it's chapter 4, wherever the 144,000 happened, I have a hard time finding it. There's this pattern John follows where he says, he hears something, it puts it a number of ways. It says, I heard, or someone said, or just quote someone starts speaking and saying something. So he hears something, says, and then I looked and I saw, and it's every time the same thing described in two different ways. The first time is when he's talking about Jesus. It says, I heard, and someone said, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So we're thinking the imagery is a lion, kingly, powerful animal. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. It says, and I looked and I saw something like a lamb that had been slain. So then we have a slain lamb. We have these two different symbols, only one's a vision, but we have two different symbolic representations for the same person, for Christ. The same thing happens with the 144,000 and the great multitude. Someone listed off to me the 144,000 of the tribes of Israel, but we notice the tribes don't match up to the actual tribes. You've got, Joseph is a tribe, but so is Manasseh, who's Joseph's son, and that's the same line. So it's weird. Dan is missing. It's a strange way of listing the 12 tribes when it's not the actual 12 tribes. And then it says, I turned and I looked and I saw a multitude no man could number, from every language, tongue, tribe, and nation. I believe that based on the pattern, this is two ways of referring to the same group, that the 144,000 and the great multitude are the same group. Why am I saying all this? Because Revelation, like Paul does in Romans in a couple of places, refers to the people of God, generally speaking, that is all the believers in Christ, in terms of Israel, as Jews or as Israel. And I think that's what's going on here. I think we have Jews who have rejected Christ, and because they've rejected Christ, it says they're a synagogue of Satan. Well, what did Jesus himself say of the Jewish leaders? You say you follow your father Abraham, but you really follow your father is Satan. So I think that's who is being referred to in this text. So in my opinion, the way I've read these texts, I don't think that we're seeing the same group or the same issue necessarily being raised in Revelation as in Galatians. But again, that's just take for what it's worth. All right, so let me just double check a couple things, see if we've got any further questions. It doesn't look like it. So I appreciate you guys being here once again. It's been awesome just to hang out with you. Like I said, check the links below. Follow me other places besides YouTube. Because not only is YouTube, pretty much suppressing this, has always been suppressing this show. So if you found it, you're one of the lucky ones. But I would recommend, Parler or MeWe. Just, follow me one of those places. Bookmark the website, beginningwisdom.org, all that stuff, just so that if something weird happens, then I'll be still doing this. I just may not be on YouTube if something weird happens. But if things go according to my plan, I will. I'll still be here for a while, but I may test out. I will definitely be uploading these shows to Rumble as well. If they start getting really good traction, it'll really spur me on to maybe try a different place to live stream, which is another reason to follow me on those other platforms. Because if I go live on another platform, then I'm not live here on YouTube. So if I do go live on some other place, I would, announce it on my various social media places, including YouTube. I put a community tab up, but those have again, just like videos, they have a hard time reaching everybody. They're subject to the same, or seems even worse, algorithms. Anyway, so just keep that in mind. Things are changing out there, but I think for the better. I think that some of these competitors have begun to really come into their own and show themselves as real competitors, and they are starting from a premise of, hey, free speech is a good thing. So I really like that. And I've heard some people complain about, bad people, people saying mean stuff on those. And I say, well, yeah, they do that everywhere. It's just that once you decide who you're following and who you're listening to and who your friends are, and that's who you see, you don't really see that stuff anymore. So that's just my 2 cents on all of that. So once again, thank you, and looking forward to seeing you guys next week. See you then.